I first saw the house on a drive back from my parents' place. It was late, close to midnight, and the empty highway stretched out in front of me like an endless black ribbon. The sky was overcast, hiding the moon, and the occasional flicker of my headlights across road signs was the only thing keeping the darkness from swallowing me whole. That's when I saw it. A burning house. It sat about 100 yards off the road, nestled at the edge of a dense patch of trees. The flames licked at the night sky, an inferno that should have been deafening, should have been crackling and roaring, but it was completely silent. No smoke, no heat, just a house engulfed in flames that made no sound. I slammed on my brakes. My heart was pounding. I looked around, expecting to see other drivers pulling over, someone calling 911, but I was alone, completely alone. My phone was on the passenger seat. I grabbed it with trembling fingers and dialed emergency services. 911, what's your emergency? There's a house on fire. It's huge, right off Highway 54, near mile marker 77. A pause. Sir, can you repeat that? I did, word for word. Are you sure about the location? Yes. I'm looking right at it. Another pause. This one longer. Then, sir, there is no house at that location. I blinked. What? There are no structures anywhere near that stretch of Highway 54. Just open fields and woods. I looked back at the house. The flames were still raging, consuming the roof, curling around the windows, devouring the walls. But the house itself wasn't collapsing. I could see the outline of the front door perfectly intact through the fire. Sir, are you certain you're not seeing a controlled burn? This isn't controlled. It's a massive house fire. You need to send someone. I trailed off as I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were people inside. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The flickering light and shifting shadows could have made it look like movement when there was none. But then a figure stepped forward. A man. He walked right up to the front window, the flames dancing around him but never touching him. His face was obscured in the glow, but I could see his shape, his outline. He raised one hand and knocked. From inside the fire. Knock, knock, knock. I swear to God, I heard it. It echoed through the night, cutting through the silence. Then another figure appeared. A woman. She moved slowly, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, like her neck was broken. Her hair was long, blackened at the edges as if the fire had singed it, but she wasn't burning. Neither of them were. And then behind them, more and more people, trapped in the fire that wasn't consuming them. But their eyes were black holes, hollow and endless, and they were all looking at me. I dropped my phone. I don't even remember putting my car back in drive, but the next thing I knew, I was speeding down the highway, heart hammering against my ribs, my hands locked in a death grip on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until the burning house was out of sight. But even then, I still felt it. That watching, that presence that had stared at me through the flames. And in the reflection of my rearview mirror, I swore I saw one of them standing on the side of the road, waiting. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I had convinced myself that I needed to go back. Maybe it was an old house that caught fire in the night, and the emergency responders had already handled it. Maybe I had imagined the figures. Maybe there was an explanation that made sense. I needed to see it again in the daylight. So I drove. I retraced my route, following the exact stretch of road, looking for any sign of burnt wreckage. But when I reached the spot, the house was gone. Not burned down, not collapsed, Not a single trace that a house had ever been there. Just untouched grass. A perfectly normal stretch of land leading into the trees. Like it had never existed. I pulled into the nearest town, Ashford, about 10 miles from the site. It was small, the kind of place with a single gas station, a diner, and a post office. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone. I found an old man sitting outside the diner, drinking coffee. He looked like he had been there for decades. I asked him about the house. House? His brow furrowed. Ain't no houses out there. I told him I'd seen one. A big Victorian-style house, white with black shutters. He frowned deeper. That sounds like the old Whitaker place. But that house burned down over 60 years ago. My mouth went dry. What? He nodded. Tragic thing. Whole family inside. Parents, 3 kids. Fire started late at night. No one made it out. The thing is, the fire never spread. It just burned the house down and stopped, like the land itself didn't want it there. A chill crawled up my spine. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking. There is no house there, I said slowly. Not in the daylight. Just an empty field. The old man looked at me for a long time, his face unreadable. Then, quietly, he said, "That's because it only burns at night." I left Ashford as soon as I could. I told myself I wouldn't go back. I told myself I would forget. But 2 nights later, something woke me at exactly 3:17 a.m. A soft, deliberate sound. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up, breath frozen in my chest. The sound was coming from outside, from the glass patio door leading to my backyard. And when I turned my head, I saw the man from the fire standing on the other side of the glass. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The man from the fire stood outside my patio door, his hollow black eyes fixed on me. The glass between us felt thinner than paper, like it wouldn't stop him if he decided to step inside. My heart slammed against my ribs. He shouldn't be here. I had left that nightmare behind on the highway, miles away. Yet there he was. He didn't knock again. He just stood there, staring, as if waiting for something. The orange glow of phantom flames flickered in the darkness behind him, but there was no fire. Just the shadowy outline of his burned, lifeless form. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn away, pretend I hadn't seen him. But my body was locked in place. Then he raised his hand, not to knock, not to wave, but to place his fingers against the glass, right where my reflection was. My breath caught. The glass fogged beneath his touch, but there was no warmth in it. Only a creeping, unbearable cold. I finally found my voice. "What do you want?" The words barely came out above a whisper. His mouth opened, just slightly, just enough that I could see the black void inside. But no sound came out. No breath. No whisper. Just silence. A silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped around me. Then a movement behind him. Another figure stepped forward from the darkness. A woman. Her head was still tilted at that unnatural angle. Her long, singed hair clinging to her burned, blackened skin. Her mouth moved like she was speaking, but again, no sound. And behind her, more shapes emerged. The whole family. Parents. 3 children. Their lifeless eyes locked onto me from beyond the glass. My stomach twisted with horror. I knew, deep down, that if I didn't move, if I just sat there watching them, they would find a way inside. I forced myself to move. I lunged for my phone, barely managing to unlock it with my shaking fingers. 911. I needed to call 911. But before I could dial, the power cut out. My bedside lamp died. My phone screen flickered violently before going black, like something had drained the battery in an instant. The darkness in my bedroom became suffocating. Only the moonlight spilling through the glass door illuminated the figures outside. They were closer now, their faces nearly pressed against the glass. The man's mouth was still open, and this time something did come out. A single word, burned into the fog of the glass. A name, Whitaker. My blood ran cold. That was the name the old man at the diner had told me. The name of the family who had died in the fire 60 years ago. And as soon as I read it, they moved. They stepped through the glass like it wasn't even there. I fell backward, scrambling away from the door, my mind screaming in terror. The figures advanced. The man's footsteps were silent despite the wooden floorboards. His black eyes locked onto mine, his mouth still gaping open in that horrible, soundless scream. The children moved in unison, their small, burned hands reaching out. The woman, she was the worst. She crawled, on her hands and knees, her head lolling unnaturally as she dragged herself across the floor toward me. A deep primal instinct in my brain screamed run, but I was trapped. The room was too small. Then I felt it, an unbearable, icy pressure against my chest, like fingers pressing into my ribs. I choked on my breath as an invisible force shoved me back against the wall. My lungs burned. My vision swam. And then I saw something impossible. The room around me changed. The walls darkened. The floor blackened. The smell of burning would fill my nose, choking me. The air turned thick with smoke, except there was no fire. Only the memory of fire. I was inside the burning house, but not as it had been on the highway. As it had been the night the Whitakers died. The furniture was intact. The wallpaper, once floral and delicate, was curling at the edges from the unseen heat. The old grandfather clock in the corner ticked down the seconds to something terrible. And the figures? They weren't burned anymore. They were alive, but they were screaming. Not soundlessly, I could hear it now. The crackling of flames. The gut-wrenching shrieks of a family trapped inside a nightmare. The woman, Mrs. Whitaker, was grabbing at me, her hands searingly cold despite the burning around us. "Help us," she cried. The words burned my ears. The children clung to me, their fingers digging into my skin. The father, the man who had first appeared in the flames, was watching. He stood in the doorway, silent, staring at me as if waiting for something, waiting for me to understand. And then the house collapsed. The walls crashed inward. The ceiling caved. The fire devoured everything. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And just before I was swallowed by the inferno, I woke up. I shot upright in bed, gasping for air. My room was dark again. The air was still. My phone lay on the nightstand, its screen glowing softly as if nothing had happened. It was just a dream, except my skin ached. I looked down at my arms and froze. There were burn marks on my wrists, finger-shaped, and on the glass of my patio door, the word Whitaker was still there, written in the fog. I should have left town that morning. I should have packed my bags, gotten in my car, and driven as far away as possible. But something was pulling me back. Something inside me knew this wasn't over. And I had to find out why, even if it meant facing the fire again. I didn't sleep the next night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, the Whitakers standing in the flames, their mouths moving, screaming soundlessly at me. But it hadn't been just a dream. The burns on my wrists, the lingering fogged word Whitaker on my patio door. Those were real, and I had to know why this was happening. I drove back to town the next morning. The diner was half empty, the old men at the counter glancing at me as I walked in, like they already knew what I'd seen. I found the same old man who had told me about the fire before. He looked up, gave me a long stare, then shook his head. "You went looking for it, didn't you?" I hesitated, then nodded. His lips pressed into a thin line. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Tell me what you saw." So I did. I told him about the house, the fire, the burned figures standing in the road. I told him about the nightmare, about waking up with burns on my skin and the name written on my glass door. He didn't look surprised. Instead, he let out a slow breath and muttered, "Damn fool ghosts just won't let go." I leaned forward. "Who were they?" The old man rubbed his jaw, eyes distant. "That family Whitakers. Good folks." He shook his head. "Their house caught fire back in '64. Whole place went up in minutes. No one made out." I swallowed hard. But why do I keep seeing them? Why do they keep appearing? The old man sighed. "Because you're the first person to really see them in years." I frowned. He continued, "Most folks drive past that stretch of road and never look twice. You saw the fire, kid." He gave me a grave look. "And now they know you can see them." A chill ran through me. "What do they want?" I asked. The old man hesitated before answering. "Help." I drove back toward the highway that afternoon, my mind reeling. Help? What could I possibly do to help the dead? But deep down, I already knew. They wanted someone to know what really happened that night. As I neared the burned patch of land where the house had once stood, my stomach twisted into knots. The road stretched ahead, eerily quiet. There were no other cars, just me. And then the smell hit me. Burning wood. I gripped the wheel. The scent was so strong, so real, I could taste the acrid smoke in my throat. Then, up ahead, the house appeared again, standing there like it had never burned. I slammed on the brakes. My pulse pounded in my ears. I knew it wasn't real. I knew it couldn't be there. But there it was, 2 stories tall, with white siding and a wraparound porch. I could even see the old wooden swing rocking gently in the wind. And in the upstairs window, a face. A little girl. She stared at me, her eyes dark, her mouth moving in soundless words. I heard the car door click open. I hadn't touched the handle, but it didn't matter, because suddenly I was no longer in my car. I gasped. The air around me was thick with smoke. The house was burning, but it wasn't destroyed yet. The wallpaper curled from the walls. The ceiling groaned as embers rained down like fiery snowflakes. The floor beneath me smoldered. But I wasn't alone. The Whitakers were there. The mother clutched her youngest child, her face streaked with soot and terror. The father banged on the front door, screaming, "It's locked. The door won't open." The children sobbed, clutching each other. And in the middle of it all, the little girl from the window. She was standing right in front of me now, her eyes wide with fear. "Help us," she whispered. I tried to speak, to move, but my body was frozen in place. The flames climbed the walls, creeping closer. The air grew suffocating. And then I heard something else. A whisper, not from the family, from behind me. I turned and saw him. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, his body hidden by smoke. But I could see his eyes. They weren't like the Whitakers. They weren't pleading or terrified. They were angry, filled with hate. A deep, guttural voice growled, "You don't belong here." Before I could react, before I could even scream, the floor collapsed beneath me. I hit the ground hard. For a moment, I thought I had fallen into the real world again. But no, I was still in the burning house. The basement. Except the fire hadn't reached here yet. The air was still, the walls damp and untouched by flames. I sat up, my head pounding, and that's when I saw it. The bones, piled in the corner, half buried under soot and rubble. Human remains. And beside them, an old, rusted can of gasoline. My breath caught. This wasn't an accident. Someone had set this fire. Someone had trapped the Whitakers inside. And now, they wanted me to know. The whisper returned. Low, threatening. You shouldn't have come here. I looked up. The shadow man was standing at the top of the stairs. And this time I could see his face. Twisted. Burned. Not from the fire. From before. From the night he had done this. I finally understood. He wasn't one of the Whitakers. He was the one who had killed them. And now he wanted me dead too. The air grew thick with smoke. The fire was coming. I had seconds to react. I lunged for the stairs, but he moved faster. His burned hands grabbed me, his grip like ice. I gasped as the world around me shifted. I was no longer in the basement. I was back in my car, and the house was gone. I sat there, shaking, my hand still gripping the wheel. But there was something in my lap, something that hadn't been there before. A piece of charwood, with a single word burned into it. Murder. The Whitakers hadn't been trapped by accident. They had been killed. And now I knew who had done it. But the worst part? I wasn't alone in my car anymore. The shadow man was sitting in the passenger seat, and he was smiling. My breath caught in my throat. He was sitting right there. The shadow man. His scorched face twisted into something that resembled a grin, but it wasn't human. His eyes gleamed in the dim light of the car, hollow and hungry, like he had been waiting for me all along. I couldn't move. My fingers felt frozen to the steering wheel. My foot refused to press the gas. I was trapped. He leaned in closer. The smell of burning flesh filled my nose. His voice came, a low, grating whisper that crawled up my spine. Now you know the truth. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The car wasn't running. The dashboard was dark. The key wasn't even in the ignition. And yet, we were moving. The road outside wasn't the road I had driven down earlier. Instead of the modern highway, I saw an older, cracked road, faded street signs, and telephone poles that looked decades old. I knew where I was. I was back in 1964. The night the Whitakers died. I tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. The car kept rolling, as if unseen hands were steering it. The shadow man didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared at me. His presence felt suffocating. Outside, the house stood as it had before the fire. Perfect. Whole. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. And then I saw him. A man, dressed in old work clothes, a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, carrying a red gas can. He moved with purpose, glancing around as he made his way to the back of the house. I recognized his face. It was the shadow man, before he became this, before the fire. I watched, helpless, as he pried open a basement window and slid inside. The car rolled forward, giving me a better view through the house's glowing windows. The Whitakers were inside. Mrs. Whitaker was washing dishes. Her husband sat on the couch, reading the newspaper. The two kids played on the floor. They had no idea that death had already stepped inside their home. I tried to scream, to warn them, but my voice was gone. Then flickers of movement inside the house. The man was pouring gasoline along the hallways in the living room near the stairs, trapping them inside. I pounded on the window, but my hands hit nothing. I wasn't really here. I was just watching. And then, the moment that had haunted them for decades, he lit the match. The fire exploded through the house. The Whitakers screamed. Flames devoured everything. The wallpaper melted. The glass in the windows shattered. The mother grabbed the children and ran for the door, only to find it wouldn't open. The father threw his weight against it. Pounded. It was locked from the outside. Their screams became inhuman. The flames wrapped around them like living things, pulling them into the inferno. The children sobbed. The mother wailed. The father cursed, until their voices vanished in the roaring fire. Then came a worse part. The killer never left. As the house burned, he stood there, watching, listening. And as the roof collapsed in on the family, a gust of wind slammed into him. The flames swallowed him whole. His screams finally joined theirs. And I realized he hadn't escaped the fire. He had died with them. And now he was trapped in it. I gasped, and suddenly I was back in my car. The world had returned to normal. The highway, the modern road signs, the empty field where the house had once stood. The passenger seat was empty. I was alone again, or so I thought, because something was still wrong. I turned, looking at my reflection in the car's side mirror, and nearly vomited. My reflection wasn't my own. It was him, the shadow man. His burned face, his hollow eyes, he was inside me now. His voice whispered in my ear, "You saw it. You felt it. Now you'll never escape it." I slammed the car into drive and tore out of there, heart hammering. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment. But the moment I stepped inside, I smelled smoke. A low ringing filled my ears, like the distant echo of burning screams. I ran to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. When I looked up at the mirror, there were handprints and soot on my skin, blackened fingerprints trailing down my arms, across my neck, like something had gripped me. And on the fogged-up mirror, a single word appeared, scrawled in a shaky, burned hand. Help. I stumbled back, breathing hard. My apartment was cold. I turned, and the lights flickered. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. I wasn't alone, and I knew now the fire hadn't ended that night. It had just found a new home. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch, staring at the scorched handprints on my arms, the burned message still lingering in the fogged mirror. The word help was seared into my mind. I wanted to believe it was just paranoia, some twisted hallucination from stress and exhaustion. But the scent of burning would still clung to my clothes. The faint ringing in my ears like distant screams never stopped. And worst of all, the shadow still lurked. It moved just out of sight, in the corners of my apartment, just beyond my peripheral vision. Watching, waiting. I needed answers. I needed to go back. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I'd gone insane. Maybe the shadow had pushed me to do it. Or maybe some part of me already knew I wasn't going to escape unless I faced it. So at midnight, I got in my car and drove. Back to the empty field. Back to where the house shouldn't be. But as I approached, it was there. The burning house stood before me, fully intact. Flames climbed the wooden frame, licking at the windows, curling around the roof. But nothing crumbled. Nothing collapsed. It was burning, but it would never be consumed. My headlights flickered. The car engine died. I tried to move, but my body felt rooted to the spot. Then I saw them. The Whitaker family. They stood inside the inferno, staring at me through the front window. Their eyes were hollow, black pits of endless suffering. their mouths twisted into silent screams. But they weren't looking at me. They were looking at something behind me. I turned, and he was there, the Shadow Man. His burned, cracked face stretched into a grin. His charred fingers reached for me. "You came back," he rasped. And before I could scream, he grabbed me. Flames swallowed me whole. The pain was unbearable, but I didn't burn. I was inside the house now, trapped with them. The Whitakers turned their hollow faces toward me. Their whispers filled my head. "You have to end it. He won't let us go. The fire must take him." I turned. The Shadow Man was grinning, and I understood. He had been part of the fire, consumed by it, and he had never left. His soul had fused with the flames, keeping them alive, feeding them. And as long as the fire burned, he would never be free. But neither would the Whitakers. I took a step toward him. "You don't belong here anymore," I whispered. His grin faded. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. The Whitakers moved closer, surrounding him. Their whispers grew louder until they became a roar. And then the fire turned on him. The flames engulfed him, consuming him completely. His screams ripped through the night. For the first time in 60 years, he was the one burning. And then the fire died. The house vanished. I was standing in an empty field, gasping for air. It was over. I don't know how long I stood there. The wind was cold. The night was silent. But I knew something had changed. The burning house wasn't coming back. The Whitakers were finally free. And as I turned to leave, I heard a whisper in the wind, a voice no longer in pain. "Thank you." I moved away a few months later. Try to start over. But sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I hear it. A faint crackling sound, like wood catching fire, like a house burning that isn't really there. And in my reflection, just for a second, I see scorched fingers reaching for me. Maybe some fires never truly die. Maybe some ghosts never really leave. And maybe, just maybe, the fire is still waiting.